were you born, Dave?
I was born in Iowa.
In Iowa? What was the music scene like in Iowa?
There really isn't a music scene. It's really rural farmland. And but for kids, high school, elementary and high school band programs were always strong back in the 60s and 70s.
And is that the way how you got introduced to jazz music, or did you have any records at home already?
Well, I had a few records, mostly my father's big band records, and what was available at the library. But it was very weak. There was no internet. There was no, any file sharing. I had to travel 200 miles to Omaha, Nebraska, to go to a record store to see. To randomly choose things that looked interesting that I had no idea what it was.
Now, what instruments do you play? Because I remember you can play saxophones, you can play harmonica, so you're a multi-instrumentalist. So how would you describe yourself as an instrumentalist? What instruments do you play?
Well, I'm a woodwind player that tries to play instruments that are not common. And the reason I do that is, as the director of jazz studies, my faculty include people like Chris Potter and Joe Lovano and Lenny Pickett and Mark Turner and people like that that are all competing for the same gigs. And I realized if I play other instruments that are of interest outside of just playing the saxophone, like the harmonica or the bass flute or the piccolo, or I play an instrument that I brought from Mongolia that's made out of an antelope horn that kind of plays like a saxophone. Those instruments seem to attract more interest because if you're competing on the international level, you have to find your own voice, your own niche. And sometimes if everybody's trying to play like the music of John Coltrane Quartet 1965, and that's the benchmark, it becomes a very crowded field of musicians playing the same way.
So what schools did you go to for studying music in order to become a professional teacher and a musician you are now?
Well, I got a Bachelor of Music Education from the University of Northern Iowa, and then I have a Master's of Music in Performance from the New England Conservatory in Boston, and I have a Doctor of Arts from New York University.
And that's also where you're functioning as a director of a jazz program, is that right?
That's correct.
That's correct. So you teach at NYU, and what classes do you teach?
I teach jazz theory, music theory, and I'm the historian for the department, so I teach jazz history.
Jazz history. Could you recommend any books for music history and music theory? Any ones that you found interesting, is like on the top of your shelf, you go, this is something that really students should have in their collection if they're enthusiastic about these topics.
Well, the History of Jazz by Ted Gioia, Gioia, is really good. As a supplement to that, I wrote a book called From the Minds of Jazz Musicians that includes 35 interviews from jazz artists from across the spectrum that intunes students into understanding the life struggle and process for that every individual artist has to deal with in order to survive. So it's like being at the right place at the right time or the right time period, or developing the right skills that are necessary to be hired. All those things are evident in my book.
Okay. Well, could you share just an idea of just an element of what it is to be in the right place in the right time?
Well, for instance, somebody like Charlie Parker coming on the scene in the 1940s, where we were moving from the swing era into something new. And so a new technology, new theory-based music called bebop was developed, and these guys understood that there has to be a new way to process improvisation and to create a language that's unique to bebop musicians or African Americans who are trying to express themselves differently from the language of the swing era and pop music and pop culture. So there were a whole bunch of musicians that were able to develop and find opportunities. There were places like Minton's Playhouse that gave them after-hours space to jam and develop. I don't know if that would happen today. I mean, everybody's trying to recreate. There's clubs like Smalls and Fat Cat that are trying to recreate that scene from the early 40s. So, I mean, that's when it started. But, being at the right place at the right time, it's like, it also means like technology compliant compared with pop culture or what the market will bear. Like, for instance, how can we have a big band era and we don't back in the 30s and 40s, and we don't have so many big bands today? Back in the 30s, there were hundreds and hundreds of big bands that were successful. And today we have, in the jazz world, maybe half a dozen. Maria Schneider or James D'Arcy Argue, or, But why was it in the 30s they were successful? One of the reasons was, or two of the reasons were, it was dance-oriented, and it invited a whole pop culture.
That's right.
But there were also no forms of amplification. There wasn't a PA system. There weren't speakers. There weren't amplifiers. So you needed a big band in order to supply enough sound for dancers. So the reason we don't have that today is we have PA systems, and we have technology that makes it possible for one person, a DJ, to create as much sound and noise as an 18-piece big band did in the 1930s. So that's being at the right place at the right time. So anybody that wants to start a swing band today, it's a battle because it's not economically viable.
For how many years have you been teaching?
Well, I've been the director for the past 16 years, and I've been an adjunct faculty member for 10 years before that, and I was a teaching assistant as a doctoral student for 5 years before that. So I've been here over 30 years.
That is an incredible career to have, as an educator and a musician. What would you say is the most important moment for you, or a person, or an event in your education, in the development of your career? What do you think is the most important moment, person, or event that happened to you in the educating system?
Well, I think one of my great teachers was finally, after doing a bachelor's degree in Iowa and a master's degree in Boston, when I got to New York, I found that there were real artisans and practitioners who could give you direct information instead of like just hints at what to practice. And one of my teachers here was a saxophone, Joe Levant, who accessed music by playing it. And
what would you say is something that every student regarding jazz background should have in their collection of instructional material?
Well, they need to have a collection of recordings that inspire them. They should also have, if they've been studying with people, they should also have an understanding of what they're trying to get out of their individual teachers. And so those are the key. Also have a community around you that can support your interest in jazz, somebody to play. mean, that's the big issue. It's like if you don't have people that have the same interests, then you either have to stop or you need to move somewhere, right? Because that's the bottom line. It's like if the community is supporting you and you don't understand what you're doing, you may completely lose the point of being a jazz musician because you're not learning the language properly.
Or would you still recommend, New York is the place where you want to go for playing jazz?
Well, I think New York is the pinnacle. I mean, that's the most densely populated city of musicians. And I mean, where my office is, you can walk to the Village Vanguard or the Blue Note or to Smalls or to the Jazz Standard. A dozen clubs within walking distance. Where else in the world can you do that?
So true. Okay, so
that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist everywhere. I mean, problem is jazz. It might be an issue in the United States that jazz isn't commercially viable because it's superseded by marketing by pop and commercial music, and I think if jazz loses its stronghold in early music education, like high school bands, we're sunk, because then nobody will be attracted to it at a young age, and they won't understand the language.
So what characteristics do define a good student?
Well, first of all, the student has to be inspired by himself. It can't be about his father loves jazz, so he's gonna make his father feel happy, and that happens sometimes. The passion has to come from the student, and but the help has to come from the parents. If the student has the passion, the parents may have to hire those private lessons, and take the kid out to live performances and fuel his inspiration, and then see where the talent comes from at that point. I always tell students or parents, I say, your kids have invested so much time, maybe starting off at like 10 or 11, 12, 13 years old, and taking lessons and buying instruments and going to summer camps. But in the end, they don't have to really pursue music if they're not 100% inspired to do so. And you know what I mean.
I do, yeah.
If you're not totally convinced that there's nothing better to do, then you maybe shouldn't do it. And I tell parents, I said, being a musician isn't like going into the priesthood where you've committed your soul to something. So, it's really people that are inspired to play. They need to go and test themselves with their teachers, and but in the end, it's the persistence. I've had people tell me, well, you'll never have a career in music. So sometimes people that offer you poor advice or negative advice pushes you to think harder about, well, is this what I want to do? And I decided yes.
What are the common mistakes or false assumptions that students make? Just to give you an example, imagine I'm a student and I think I will go to school, and after school the first thing that I'm going to do, I will tour around the world as a famous musician. Is that something that the young students are still thinking, or they're more down to earth where the reality stands?
Well, I think most music students don't think that far. They're asked. They think this is really fun. This is interesting. I'm meeting these interesting people. I get a focus on things that are fun, but they don't. I think they have in the back of their head that if I go to New York, for instance, I'll meet some people and then I'll get a chance to play. But they don't really think it out through their whole life, because, as you know by now, that as we get older, students get younger, and it's like they don't. And you see that maybe when we were that young, we had that same feeling like, oh, maybe one day we'll play with this guy or whatever. But the reality is, as we get older, we see that it's a very long process, and it's a much greater commitment than young people can imagine. I think they want instant gratification. Where I tell them, you sound pretty good. It might take you a year to get to play with somebody of importance, or maybe 10 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on how long you want to pursue that. Now, the good news for us at NYU, we're a liberal arts school where students can major in jazz studies, but also dabble in other liberal arts courses where they might all of a sudden say, you know what, I never considered another career path because I've always been focused in music. And they've just kind of held a blind eye to any other possibilities until they get here, and then they take some math or science or English or language class, and they realize, hey, this actually interests me more.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, music's supposed to open up our mind, but sometimes we get so focused in trying to pursue that only, we leave out the other options in life. I mean, it's interesting, when I interviewed Dave Liebman on my online interview series, and my last question was, what are your what's your recommendation for our students? Any words of wisdom? And he said, double major, because if you just focus, study music, and learn to be a musician, and then you go out in the real world, you want to be able to separate playing the music that you want to play as compared to playing the music that you have to play, which might be playing weddings and bar mitzvahs and playing on the street, rather than recording your original music with string quartet and full big band, whatever, So his suggestion is find a way to support yourself financially through other means, so that you can save your music and pursue that on the highest level.
Dave, next part is auditioning process at NYU. So what are new applicants asked to demonstrate at the audition?
Well, they're just asked we actually have a jam session where every student gets to play with each other and gets to pick their favorite tune that they feel most comfortable on or with, so that we can evaluate them that way to hear their language. Because we find that many auditions are so invasive. It's just one student standing in a spotlight surrounded by a group of adjudicators, which is kind of a cold way to evaluate somebody's creative abilities.
Well, that's something new I haven't heard of. Very good. So what is it that you're evaluating when you're focusing? So you mentioned jazz language. Is there anything else you're particularly focused on?
Well, their ability to play their instrument at a certain level that's high enough that we can take that and take them further.
Is there such a thing that you would say, oh, this is medium level, this is really high level, this is very low level? Is there something that defines the fine line between these three?
Oh, sure. It's very easy to find. It's just like, you can talk to students and say, who are your favorite musicians? What are your favorite records? Who have you studied with? What do you study? I mean, you can just find out from speaking to people, but then when you hear them play, you look at their posture and their technique and the quality of their instrument, the way that they execute their phrases. Does it sound like something professional? Does it sound like they've listened to this saxophone player or this guitar player, or does it just sound like they've learned the blues scale and they listen to heavy metal thrash music? So it's actually very easy to evaluate.
Do you have a chat with those students before they start playing, or is it afterwards?
Well, we invite them to campus. We're going to do our first our auditions, live auditions, We basically want to hear them play first, show us what they have without trying to taint what they do.
Okay.
And then we take them out to dinner and talk to them in a calm environment.
Now, what advice can you give to highly motivated, passionate, but unsuccessful applicants?
Well, if they're passionate and they're persistent, they'll eventually succeed. If that persistence is strong and their capabilities and understanding of what they're trying to accomplish is true and honest. I mean, if somebody is passionate and they come in and they can't play, unfortunately, it's not our job to evaluate what's wrong with them. We're just going to say you're accepted or not accepted.
Okay.
But if they're not accepted, they should go back to their teacher and say, what's going on here? What am I missing? That's the best thing, to study with people and pay them to say, evaluate my ability. And that's probably the best answer I can give.
So what kind of wisdom would you give to young students?
Well, I think, the one thing we never talk about in music, especially jazz music, is the process of jazz music and improvisation. I call that creative problem solving. So if you become a good improviser, you can potentially become a good manager, thinker, figure out problems much broader than in music. It's like as an example, I've used music as a process to figure out how do I get from Iowa in the middle of a cornfield. And it was a long journey, but it's like, you figure that out. It's just like when you play with somebody, how do you not take too many choruses, or how do you play in tune, or how do you make sure you don't get lost in a conversation? All those things can apply to real life, and I think if more people understood jazz and understood the process of jazz, we could expose that on like a TED Talk to the world, and understand. It's like I don't want to talk about my book again, but each story is unique and individual to that person. So for a jazz musician, just like your life is different, you're going between Prague and Ireland. Like, who else does that? You're the only person that I know that has those connections. You've created a career by doing what you do, but the musicians that you play with might have totally different experiences on how they survive. So, some musicians may play great, but they have a day job working in a bank or teaching or whatever. So it's the creative process and improvisation that kind of dictates how we manage our lives. And if we want to continue to share that with students and keep this art form viable. It's like we can't forget that it's a group effort and it's a conversation. So, in other words, it's a language that has to be learned in order to convey something. There's a teacher on my faculty, one of the great drummers in the world, N.Y.C, says that artists have a responsibility to be light bearers, meaning that for the moment that you're in a performance as an audience member, while the band is playing on stage, all of a sudden all your issues and troubles and conflicts melt away and you're focused on the beauty of music. And it's the same feeling when you go to a cinema and the lights go down and all of a sudden the screen comes up with the soundtrack and the plot and all the characters, and all of a sudden you forget that you're not feeling well, or you have financial problems, or your girlfriend just broke up with you, but you're engrossed in something that entrains your mind into calm and positive thought.
I hope you will have a lovely day today.
You too. You take care, man.
Okay. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.